Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this English lesson where I'm going to talk about air travel. I must admit, I have not been on a plane for a very, very long time, and I think many of you could probably say the same thing. At least many of you haven't been on a plane in the last year and a bit. As I was revamping an earlier lesson about travel in general, I realized that I hadn't done a good English lesson about air travel. So in this English lesson, we'll talk about air travel. Specifically, we'll talk about airports and airplanes and all the things that go along with traveling by air. Obviously, if you are going to travel by air, you're going to either go by plane or by helicopter. I would think 99% of you would travel by plane. If you were going to make a trip and it required going a long distance, you are most likely going to take a plane. Sometimes we actually say airplane. Generally, though, we just say plane. I don't think very many of us travel by helicopter, although it is another way to do air travel, although I think it's a lot more expensive. I have been on an airplane. I have been on a plane many times in my life, probably about 9 or 10 times. That counts as a lot, doesn't it? I have never been on a helicopter. I don't know what it's like. I would love someday to go in a helicopter and see what it's like. But I have only traveled by plane. Notice I'm flipping a lot of prepositions around there. You travel by plane, but when you're actually on a plane, you use on. I didn't want to accidentally use in. But we can use in when we're boarding the plane. When you board the plane, it's time to go in the plane. I wouldn't say that. I would say on most of the time. And then you travel by helicopter. I've never been on a helicopter. The place where you find airplanes is called the airport. We're going to get some of the basic vocabulary out of the way first. The airport is usually a large place in a large city where airplanes can take off and airplanes can land, and where airplanes can be refueled, and where you can board the airplane and where you can get off of the airplane. So an airport near you probably has a specific name. The closest airport to me is Hamilton International Airport, not Toronto. You might have thought it was Toronto, but it's not. So different countries have different airlines. In Canada, we have a couple of airlines. The most common airline, or probably the biggest airline, is called Air Canada. An airline is a company that owns planes, and they put the name of the company on the side of the plane. You probably have heard of Air France. Maybe you've heard of KLM out of Holland. Maybe you've heard of, I think there's Air India. I think there's Emirates. There are a number of different airlines in the world, especially if you go to the United States. There are a lot of different airlines in the United States. But an airline is simply the company that owns the planes, and generally each country has its own airlines. Our airline, Air Canada, was actually in trouble this year because of the pandemic. So our government just gave Air Canada billions of dollars so they could not go broke. When a company goes broke, it means they don't have enough money to operate. But Air Canada is good for now because the Canadian government gave them a lot of money. An airplane lands on a runway and takes off from a runway. So if you ever see an airport from the air, you'll see a number of different runways. Large airports have tons of runways, short runways, long runways. Generally, a runway is made out of pavement or concrete. It's a hard surface where an airplane can take off and where an airplane can land. And most runways obviously have numbers, and they have lights along the side so that airplanes can take off and land at night as well. When an airplane is getting ready to take off, it needs to drive from the airport building to the runway. And we actually have a special verb for this. We say it's taxiing. The airplane will taxi along the runway until it gets to the spot where it can line up and it can take off. After an airplane lands, it will also taxi from the end of the runway over to the airport, maybe to the terminal. The airport terminal is where people get on and off of planes, or it might taxi to an airport hangar, which is like a big building where the airplane can go inside and they can do maintenance on it and store the airplane. But anytime an airplane taxis, when you see an airplane taxiing on the runway, that means it is driving on its wheels in order to go to a building or to come from a building to get ready to take off. So once again, when an airplane goes up into the air, we say that it's going to take off. It takes off from the runway and then it's in flight. And then when it's in the air, we have a term called airborne. So when you're on an airplane, you might hear the flight attendant say, please keep your seatbelts on until we're airborne. Or at some point, once we're airborne, we will serve the in-flight meal. Airborne simply means that you are in the air. They might actually just use the phrase in the air. Airborne is a little more of a formal term, but it simply means that an airplane is flying. And then, of course, did I use Air Canada for all my pictures? Most of them. Of course, once a flight is over, an airplane will land. They will put the landing gear down and they will land. So I'm using a lot of words that I don't actually have slides for. I do have a lot of slides this morning. So please pay attention as well to the words and phrases I'm using. When an airplane is landing, it will put the landing gear down, so the wheels will go down and the airplane will land on the runway. There's a couple different kinds of flights. There's a lot of different ways to talk about flying or air travel. And one is to say some flights are international and some flights are domestic. So an international flight is a flight that goes from one country to another country. If I fly from here to France, that would be an international flight. When I went to the airport, I would want to go to the area where the international flights both arrive and take off. So the departure and arrivals for international flights. Actually, I would want to go to the departures area for international flights. International flights usually have larger planes. Usually some of the really big airplanes are used for international flights because they want to take as many people as they can. And they're generally flying from large airports to large airports, which allows large airplanes to take off and land. Domestic flights happen within a country. So if I wanted to fly to another province, I could fly from the province of Ontario to the province of Alberta. I would take a domestic flight, okay? I would take a flight that does not leave the country, but simply travels within the country. Domestic flights, these can be large airplanes, but sometimes they are smaller airplanes because they travel between smaller airports. So in Canada, we have a lot of domestic flights and international flights happening at the same time. In a normal year. Right now, there aren't a lot of flights happening. There's a lot of cargo jets flying right now, transporting things instead of people, but there's definitely a lot less international and domestic flights. So at the airport, you have the arrivals area, and it will be called the arrivals area. If you were going to the airport to pick someone up, you would go and wait by the arrivals area. You would wait for them to come off the plane and come out of the arrivals area. So when you land at an airport, the first place that you are in when you get off the plane is the arrivals area. And then when you go to the airport, you go to the departures area. So the departures area, let me make this a little bit bigger. You can see it on the sign there. The departures area is the place or the part of the airport you go to when you need to get on an airplane to travel somewhere. And airports are generally split up this way. There's usually international arrivals and departures, domestic arrivals and departures. Some smaller airports combine all of them, but usually at larger airports, they will split those up. So if you have a friend flying in from another part of your own country, you would probably meet them in the domestic arrivals area of the airport. And then, of course, you have arrival time and departure time. These are simply the times when your flight leaves, or when your flight, when your flight arrives, or when your flight leaves. So sometimes when you know someone is coming from far away, they'll say, oh, my arrival time is 4 p.m. Or they might even say, my departure time is 1 p.m. and my arrival time is 4 p.m. I have a 3-hour flight. But you definitely have arrival time and departure time. So at airports, you have gates. A gate is basically the area where you get on a plane or get off a plane. When you have your plane ticket, it will say that you need to go to gate 7, or you need to go to gate T9, or you need to go to gate G4. Sometimes they have letters and numbers. Sometimes it's just a number, depending on the size of the airport. Sometimes what airports will do is if it starts with a certain letter, it's an arrival gate. And if it starts with another letter, or if it's a different number, it's a departure gate. But a gate is basically an area with lots of chairs where you either wait to get on your plane or where you come off your plane. Your flight can be on time, your flight can be delayed, or your flight can be canceled. When your flight is on time, it simply means if your flight is supposed to leave at 1 o'clock, it's going to leave at around 1 o'clock. Nothing's perfect at an airport, but if your flight is on time, it means it will leave on time. Or if you're waiting for someone to come to the airport to land, it means that their flight is on its way and it's going to land on time. If a flight is delayed, obviously it's not on time, but it's still happening. So your flight, instead of leaving at 1, maybe it's going to leave at 2. Maybe there is a 1-hour delay. Or again, if you're waiting for someone at the airport, possibly they're supposed to arrive at 4 p.m. If their flight's delayed, maybe they're arriving at 4:30 or 5 o'clock. This happened a lot last March. Many flights were canceled. When a flight is canceled, it's just not happening. This is not a nice thing to see if you are traveling. It's not a nice thing to realize that your flight is canceled, especially if you're really looking forward to going on a trip. In order to get on a plane, obviously you need a ticket. Now, again, we live in a modern world. A lot of the paper aspects of traveling have become digital now. In fact, already the last time that I went on a flight, I didn't have a paper ticket. I just took my phone with me, and my ticket was an e-ticket on my phone. But certainly you can still have paper tickets. That's common as well. But you do need to buy a ticket. You do need to book a flight if you want to go somewhere. So definitely you need to have a ticket. When you get to the airport, if you are going on a trip, you need to go to the check-in. You need to check your baggage. That means you need to give them your suitcases. Generally at the airport, there's 2 types of check-in now. For a lot of flights, you can check in at a machine where you simply enter your information and you check in. And then you can check in with a person as well. I think most airports still have both, although this to me seems a lot more popular now for people to check in using this machine. You will get a luggage tag. So YYZ, we say Z in Canada, is the airport code for Toronto International Airport, Pearson International Airport. You need to put tags on your luggage so that you know, so that people know where your luggage needs to go to. Hopefully that makes sense. But every suitcase needs a luggage tag or baggage tag. We use a bunch of different names for it. Luggage tag, baggage tag, both of those work. Let's see here. Boarding pass. So a ticket and a boarding pass are kind of different, although they're merging a little bit into the same thing when you go digital. But certainly if you book a flight, you have a plane ticket. But in order to get on the plane, you need a boarding pass. Sometimes when you go to the airport, you show your ticket, your paper ticket or e-ticket, and they give you a boarding pass, or it converts to a boarding pass. And that will tell you where on the plane you're actually sitting. So this tells you your flight number. It tells you what row you're in and what seat number you're in. So your boarding pass is like the same as a ticket, but it comes after the ticket. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, in our current digital world, it doesn't all work the same way anymore. It used to be a paper ticket and a paper boarding pass. And for some flights, it might still be that way. For some flights, you might have an e-ticket and an e-boarding pass on your phone. When you get on a plane, you board a plane. Now, I must say, in Canada, we rarely get on a plane this way. Okay, so these people are on a set of stairs and they're climbing up onto a plane. Because we have winter in Canada and it's very, very cold, most of our airports just have a tunnel that you go through to get on the plane. Although some of our airports are smaller airports, you would still get on a plane this way. But when you get on a plane, we say that you are boarding, okay? When you're at the gate, they might say, we're going to board rows F through Z. So if you have a ticket for rows F through Z or a boarding pass, please report. So when you board the plane, you are getting on the plane. I see Rod in the chat say, how I miss traveling. Yeah, this is the lesson about how we all miss traveling. It's kind of sad. Anyways, as I mentioned, the person who works on the plane, the person who helps you find your seat, the person who maybe brings you your meal or a snack, the person who explains all of the safety instructions, we now call them flight attendants, at least in Canada. I think they do in the United States as well. But definitely when you go on a plane, there are people that work there and they are called flight attendants. Let's see here. The flight deck or the cockpit is where the pilot and co-pilot fly the plane. So generally the pilot sits on the left, I think, and the co-pilot sits on the right. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but the flight deck or the cockpit is where they sit. Generally, we call it a flight deck when there's more than one person there. And if the airplane only has a seat for the pilot, a smaller plane, we would call it a cockpit. But most English speakers use both terms interchangeably, okay? Sometimes you'll hear that a little kid got to visit the cockpit of the plane. Although as we have heightened security on flights now, it's usually pretty rare for people to see the flight deck or to get a visit to the cockpit. I think that's all things we used to do that we don't do anymore. So pilot flies the plane. Co-pilot also flies the plane, but also helps fly the plane. So most of the time the pilot is flying. Sometimes the co-pilot will fly for a bit. Honestly, I don't know a lot about what they do other than they take off and they land the plane. I do also know, though, that my cousin is married to an Air Canada pilot. That must be pretty cool because they get to travel for free, I think. Anyways, if you are on a plane, if you are not a flight attendant, if you are not a pilot or co-pilot, you are most likely a passenger. So the general term for people who travel by air are air passengers. You are a passenger on a plane. You will be referred to as a passenger. So they'll make announcements like, passengers for flight C400, please report to gate 6. Passengers for flight C400 may begin boarding. So you have to listen for that word if you are traveling. You are a passenger. Let me double check where I am. We're doing good. When you arrive at an airport, you will most likely go to customs. If you have arrived in a different country, they will ask if you have anything to declare, if you are bringing anything in. When I returned to Canada from other countries, I needed to go through customs as well. And the Canadian workers would ask me, the customs officials would ask me if I was bringing anything into Canada. But customs is where you go after an international flight. And then you also need to go to baggage claim. So there will be a carousel. So that's something that goes around and around, and all of the luggage, all of the suitcases, all of the baggage will come out there. We generally use, at least in Canadian English, we generally call it luggage. Or you just say my bags. I need to get my bags from the baggage claim. We do call it the baggage claim though. We don't call it the luggage claim or the suitcase claim. So sometimes you'll hear people say, yeah, I'm landing at 4. I'm just going to grab my bags from the baggage claim. I'll meet you outside, or I'll take a taxi, or I'll take an Uber. So there's a couple kinds of trips as well. There's a round trip where you buy a ticket to go to a country, and it includes a return ticket. So it allows you to go there and come back. You've paid for both flights. But there's also what's called a one-way ticket. So that just takes you there and you don't have a ticket home. So if you're going for a normal vacation, maybe a week, maybe 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, you generally buy a round trip ticket. You have paid to get to your destination and you've paid to come home again. But maybe you're going for a longer period of time. Maybe you're going to work there for a while. You would buy a one-way ticket. I have never traveled first class. This is the most expensive kind of ticket. I will never travel first class. Even if I had lots of money, I don't think I would travel first class. There's also business class. I did on actually twice in my life, I got bumped up to business class. I had bought an economy class ticket, but they gave me an upgrade. They bumped me up to business class. So I paid for economy, but I got to fly in business class. So I think you understand the difference. First class is the best place to sit on a plane. The seats are really big. The seats might even fold down into kind of a small bed. You have all kinds of luxuries. Business class is a little more comfortable than economy class. The seats are a little wider. Maybe you get an extra pillow and you might have a little more privacy. And then economy class is where I have flown on almost every one of the flights I've been on. It can be squishy, it can be crowded. Sometimes it's really warm, sometimes it's really cold, but it's usually the most economical way to fly. You can have a window seat, you can have an aisle seat, or a middle seat. So of course, a window seat allows you to see out of the plane. I love having a window seat, but sometimes it's hard to get out if you need to use the bathroom. The aisle seat is, of course, along the aisle. Now, we had a question earlier about whether everyone called it the aisle seat. Back when we had members only chat. Let's see here. Let me scroll back. Yeah, I'll just let it go for now. I'm pretty sure I call it the aisle seat. If anyone else knows another name for this, let us know in the chat. But generally, I refer to it as window seat, aisle seat, and middle seat. Sometimes there's more than one middle seat. I was on a plane once where it was 4 seats across. So definitely the middle seat is the least enjoyable seat, in my opinion. With the aisle seat, you have more leg room sometimes because you can stick one leg out into the aisle. But leg room refers to the amount of space that you have for your legs. On some airplanes, there's not very much leg room. On other airplanes, the seats are further apart and you have more leg room. When you fly on a discount airline, that's the really cheap airline. We call them discount airlines. You don't have a lot of leg room. They put as many seats in the plane as they can. There is an overhead compartment where you can put your carry-on. So the overhead compartment, let me make this a bit bigger. The overhead compartment is where you can store a small bag. Maybe you've brought a backpack. Maybe you've brought a piece of carry-on luggage. We actually just call this a carry-on. We've made this a noun as well as an adjective. So you can call this a carry-on bag. You can call this carry-on luggage, or you can just call it a carry-on. We've made it a noun. We've nounified it. I don't know if that's a word, but we made it a noun. So you check in and you give them your larger suitcases at the baggage check-in. But you can take usually one bag on the airplane with you, depending on the flight. And it must be a certain size. It can't be bigger than a certain size. And we call this your carry-on. Some airlines, they might let you have a carry-on and a backpack, although it's becoming quite strict now what you can take. You might have an in-flight meal. We also just call this airplane food, or we might just call it a meal. But if your flight is long enough, at a certain point during the flight, they might serve you an in-flight meal. When you get off the plane, though, people will just call it airplane food. They'll say, how was the airplane food? Was the airplane food any good? Did you get a meal? Was the airplane food any good? So in-flight meal is the formal term. And then sometimes we just call it airplane food. I've had both good and bad airplane food. By the way, when I went to South Africa, I flew Air France, and I had an amazing meal on the Air France flight. So if you're from France, Air France, that was a good airline. For some reason, there's still a no smoking sign or a no smoking light. I don't know why. We haven't been allowed to smoke on planes probably for 20 or 30 years, but there is still a no smoking sign, and there is a fasten seatbelt sign, which is interesting as well, because most of the time they recommend that you wear your seatbelt almost all the time on a flight, especially if there's going to be turbulence. But if you look up, there's usually a no smoking sign, which is always on because you can't smoke. And then there will be a fasten seatbelt sign. And the seatbelt on an airplane, of course, looks like this. It looks a little different than a car seatbelt. Our car seatbelts have a different buckle. But you might hear the flight attendant say, please fasten your seatbelts. They might say, please buckle your seatbelts. That's a little more rare. But between passengers, you might hear people say, hey, it's time to buckle up. If you hear someone say it's time to buckle up, it means that you need to put your seatbelt on. Let's see here. You want to wear your seatbelt, especially if there's turbulence. Turbulence is when the airplane goes up and down really quickly or just shakes. I have been on a couple of flights where there was really bad turbulence. That is not fun when there's a lot of turbulence. It can be a little bit scary when there's a lot of turbulence. I definitely wear my seatbelt when there's turbulence. And I'm pretty sure the last flight I was on, they wanted us to wear our seatbelts the whole time. I haven't traveled for a while. So if you have traveled a lot more recently, let me know in the chat if you're required to wear your seatbelt all the time. I think you are now. So we have two names for the little bag. It's called an air sickness bag. So if you feel sick and you need to throw up, the other word is vomit, you use the air sickness bag. But the general term for it, we just call it a barf bag. In English, when you say someone barfed, it means they were sick to their stomach and all of their food came out of their mouth. They threw up, they vomited. On an airplane, sometimes people get sick and they might need to use the air sickness bag. And then the general informal term for it, we just call it a barf bag. I don't know, for some reason that makes me laugh. You might have a direct flight. Now, interestingly enough, a direct flight does land. So if I take a direct flight from here to Sao Paulo, okay, it probably will still land in Florida. It'll probably still land once, but I will stay on the same plane for the whole trip. And then a nonstop flight takes off and it lands at your destination. No stops along the way. You might have a connecting flight. So a connecting flight means you leave on one plane, you land at an airport, but it's not your destination. You get off your plane and you get on a different plane and then you fly again. You might have one or more connecting flights in order to get to your destination. I once flew from British Columbia and we had 3 connecting flights. So we landed 3 times and we had to run across the airport to get to our next flight. And I also went on a trip once where we landed at O'Hare in Chicago and our connecting flight was all the way on the other side of the airport. And we had to run the whole way across the airport to get to our connecting flight. Let's see here. And then you might have a layover. A layover might be a couple hours. A layover might be all night. But a layover is when your connecting flight doesn't leave right away. So you land at an airport and you might have a 3-hour layover. You might have a 4-hour layover, which means you just need to, you'll be at the airport for a few hours while you're waiting for your next flight to leave.